right, good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction. And also let me thank in advance our impressive panel who are coming with me today from Richmond, Fairfax here and locally. These are individuals who are not only wicked smart, but leading change agents in our community and our nation. So I want to thank each of them for presenting with me today. I am Dr. Sylisa Lambert-Woodard, and I'm President and CEO of Pathway Homes. And here on slide 6, I want to share a little bit with you in the beginning, and then we will have each panelist take the lead to present today an overview in regards to permanent supportive housing and a particular focus on the population that we serve. So Pathway Homes is actually a private nonprofit organization. We're celebrating our 40th year as a leading behavioral healthcare organization built on the foundation of housing. We provide services to individuals with serious mental illness, substance use disorders, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and co-occurring illnesses, of which 65% were homeless before coming into Pathways, and all others coming from hospitals or precariously housed. Our agency is really fortified by 3 tenets. Tenets or beliefs that individuals with mental illness can and do recover. Therefore, we provide behavioral and integrated healthcare, case management, crisis stabilization, outpatient services, and homeless services in a continuum of homes such as psychiatric assisted living facilities, group homes, townhomes, and scatter site 1-bedroom units and 2-bedroom units across the region. Pathways is located both in Northern Virginia and in Central Florida. And we stand upon these foundations that allow us to be able to have flexibility in the community. The second tenet that I mentioned that we believe in is that housing is a right, not a privilege. And as a result of the lack of affordable housing in our area, Pathways also engages in acquisition and development with over 400 units set aside, all for non-time limited permanent supportive housing. Our third tenet is really to serve and to lead with an equity lens to support our mission by remaining committed to providing education and advocacy to include diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we recognize that institutional racism and stigma has led to disparities in health, housing, income, and criminal justice system. We strive really to continue to advocate for equitable housing through our mission to prevent discrimination. Because ultimately we believe that housing can decide, everything in regards to your trajectory, from how safe you are to the food you eat, to the quality of your health care, your job, the quality of your children's education. So those of us here today, nonprofits, developers, government entities, and foundations, we all have a call to action to rezone for inclusion, to redesign for universal adaptability and with respect to our carbon footprint, and sustain a community of care that's really embedded and tailored in services that reverses the social determinants of health, which of course these determinants oftentimes prematurely kills. So we really declare safe, stable, and affordable housing, again, a right, not a privilege, and permanent supportive housing is really a best practice in stabilizing lives, which is ultimately what we'll be focusing in on this morning. If you can advance to slide 7, please. So homelessness homelessness is the challenges that we see here is that individuals with serious mental illness typically they die an average of 10 to 20 years earlier than the general population. And we have been working to be able to begin to change those numbers significantly. The majority of those suffering from mental illness we're finding are homeless. So 1 in 4 individuals suffer from mental illness, 1 in 25 suffer from serious mental illness. And so we're seeing this very large number of individuals, again, over a third, that are actually homeless that suffer from these illnesses. And oftentimes the symptoms that are associated with these exacerbate homelessness if it's even possible to do so. The types of symptoms that are demonstrated are those such as thought and affective disorders. And oftentimes these are described by disorganized thinking and emotional dysregulation. People with untreated serious mental illness really are suffering from conditions that we traditionally know as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and major depression, anxiety, of course, and PTSD. And so these neighbors of ours are weathered. I call them weathered by the environmental stressors, directly exposed without mask and unable to provide the proper hygiene for themselves. These individuals are highly vulnerable and obviously disproportionately exposed to COVID-19. They're unsheltered from the elements, resulting in chronic health problems such as COPD, emphysema, other respiratory diseases, as well as diabetes, hypertension, asthma, cardiometabolic disease, and hypothermia. So these are things that we are being challenged with in being able to manage. And of course, the stigma, discrimination, and racism is a significant impact in regards to those individuals who are found to be homeless. If you could advance to slide 8, please. So Virginia has been on a successful path to reduce homelessness, but with less impact on homeless individuals with SMI. So our annual point in time count allows us to look back from 2010 to up to this past year. And you can see the percent change by subpopulation. And with traditional interventions, all populations, substance use disorders, veterans, families, and other chronically homeless have realized notable gains. However, within the SMI population, we have been less impactful. In our most recent point in time survey, we're now seeing an upward trend, not only homelessness overall, but particularly within this very vulnerable population. And we must not forget that among the estimated 500,000, it's about 568,000 last year that was quoted for national homelessness. African Americans, despite making up just 13% of the population, account for a staggering disproportionate number of 40% of the total homeless population. That's even higher for African American families. So it's really important to acknowledge the compounding effects of longstanding racism and discrimination and inequalities within our country's housing system, criminal justice system, and healthcare systems. And it is important that we recalibrate policy and practices. It's time to recognize that while untreated mental illness and poverty and the lack of affordable housing create, a clear rationale for homelessness, it's also important to use an equity lens to acknowledge race as a clear construct of this American crisis. Slide 9, please. So we are all being challenged to reassess our traditional homeless system, service system. Our communities across the nation have traditionally provided support to individuals and families who are homeless through an array of emergency, crisis-driven transitional housing services, as well as shelter beds, in part because this is what HUD was paying for. But there's a delta between fair housing advocates and low-income advocates, with fair housing advocates focusing on the oversaturation of housing in disadvantaged areas, and low-income advocates focusing on building as many units as cost effectively as possible. And so we need a paradigm shift, right? Equitable growth is really the path to sustained economic prosperity. And so as we plan for our future, equity and growth need to be pursued together. In embedding housing equity into local regional development strategies, these are imperative to avoid the residual effects of redlining that was banned over 50 years ago, the effects of public housing that really denied appreciation of land and asset accumulation. And I actually think the major problem with public housing is that by definition, it was publicly owned, and so it created an institutional life and dependency was created. And so, with any long-term dependency, be it on on drugs or toxic environment, the end result is really deadly. So a critical intervention, permanent supportive housing, which is also extremely affordable. This is something, that the commitment that we need to have in terms of providing services that are integrated with healthcare, employment training, and access to the amenities that really empower individuals to recover and thrive, and allow us to create healthier communities. Slide 10, please. Okay, so when we view housing as a social determinant of health, it becomes clear that ending homelessness is more than what a homeless system can handle. So homelessness exacerbates these existing resources and sometimes results in a cycle of homeless chronicity as individuals move from one system of care to another, attempting to address a host of unmet needs. So advance to slide 11, please. So why permanent supportive housing? Because it really is an equitable solution to this health crisis. Because it's evidence-based, best practice, it's a high fidelity model that provides low barrier, affordable housing and non-time limited services to include healthcare to individuals who are homeless or precariously housed. The key to successful permanent supportive housing is the intentional empowerment of consumer choice, the relationship building and the collaboration between service providers, tailored and flexible non-time limited services with subsidies that ensure the affordability and the integration throughout all communities to ensure that we're not oversaturating anyone. Supportive housing really successfully interrupts this cycle. And so people with histories of incarceration or institutionalization significantly reduce their use on these systems and other systems after moving into supportive housing. And you can see here in this one example, the cost alternatives, the responsiveness and the cost effectiveness, and the return on investment that we're seeing just at Pathways in comparison to some of those other highly resourced options. $800 a day at a psychiatric hospital, and these are conservative figures. $560 or more for an emergency room stay. I don't know if anyone's been at Inova lately, but that is very conservative. $167 a night in jail, $37 for a shelter, compared to $25 a day at Pathways with services that have subsidized housing embedded within it. Slide 12, please. So I think there is actually a very simple formula for a successful design. And that's going to be operationalized for you a bit more as we move forward in our presentation. But in so many ways, it's just as simple as capital investments plus subsidies plus supportive services. And in being able to embrace the simplicity of the formula allows us, I think, to be far more operational for our future. What we're going to have is Dr. Vincent's going to be able to share some of the effective models, the outcomes of success, forecasting, and some real life examples of this design so that you're able to see how this formula actually evolves. Dr. Vincent?
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me? Oh, can you guys hear me? No?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lambert-Woodard, and good morning, everybody. So now that Sylisa set the stage, I guess the question is, so how do we make this happen? For those of you who are familiar with HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is where we've historically received a lot of the funding for our PSH models. HUD is pretty clear about the types of PSH models that it funds. More recently, the state has stepped in, and we're going to be very happy to share those successes with you. For our purposes, there are three types: the TRA, SRA, or PRA. What we mostly do is the SRA. This is the type where, we are getting the funding, we are looking for the leasing, the units to lease, and then having people come into those units with us as the primary lessor, and then lessee, and then we sublet to the clients. And I'll talk a little bit later about why it's set up that way. The other two, for our purposes, don't necessarily happen a lot. I think sometimes some of the models you hear me talk about, you might recognize some of the tenant-based rental assistance aspects of it, but primarily we're dealing with SRAs mostly. Next slide, please. Okay, so the model, what is the model that we're basing this PSH on? So PSH has been around a long time. I mean, recently we've heard a lot more about it as SAMHSA has come out with their evidence-based PSH model, which the state has been a huge champion of. Historically, pathway homes, our bread and water has always been PSH. It's just that the language we're using these days is different. And so the things that we've stood up PSH on are the ones that I think have made it successful in the ways that you will see. So housing first, harm reduction. We all know the populations that we're serving, as Sylisa talked about, are folks who are coming directly from homelessness. About 60 up to 70% of those folks usually are coming with a co-occurring substance use disorder. And we found, and research has shown, that getting people into homes first and then worrying about all the other things that they come with is the way to go. So housing is securely based on a housing first model, which is also the model that HUD and the state recognize and support. The other piece that makes what we do a little bit different is that we're both the landlord in some of our PSH and the service provider. So if you look at our housing inventory and you look at our housing org chart, you will see that there are folks that we provide just housing to. We don't provide any clinical services. We're teaming up with other providers, and we're just the landlord. And so our services are limited to, you know, maintenance and things that any landlord would do. And then we have other settings where we're the service provider and we're providing, you know, clinical supports in the traditional sense that you know it. So people are clinically trained, master's level clinicians are doing, you know, the supported counseling, they're doing, you know, sometimes case management, skill building. And then more recently, we've been doing more tenancy supports. And as we talk about these, you'll see how these are different. Also be happy to welcome questions later on about those. The other thing that makes this a successful model is we could not do this alone. We've had to stand, you know, beside our partners in making sure that all the things that we need, everything from advocacy to looking at things like fair housing, to looking at landlords and community housing and development of new housing, we could not have done without some of the folks that you're going to be hearing from here today. And then just it's ongoing education and advocacy. In my position personally, I think I spend maybe 60% of my time engaging with landlords in the community or something related to that. Or, you know, whether it's across the state or locally, it's usually something to do with, you know, facilitating this fine balance between making sure that our folks are housed and making sure that they're not being targeted because of the, you know, the challenges that they're working with. And then of course, having our own housing inventory is making this possible, because without the housing inventory that, you know, thanks to Sylisa, way back when we had silver lining funds and things like that come on, she had the foresight to start, you know, really actively developing our acquisition model. And that puts us in a position to be able to support some of these really wonderful funding opportunities that come down the pike. Because without the housing to put people in, it doesn't matter how much money you bring to the table if you can't put people in units. You know, they're still going to be on the streets. Next slide, please. So, you know, in terms of outcomes, so what is the ROI? Sylisa gave you some numbers, and, you know, we know that everybody who funds these projects and we ourselves are always interested in not just the number of people that we serve. I mean, that's the old way of looking at outcomes, which is, you know, how many people did we serve? 50,000, 100,000. The real issue for us and what we focus on is just one key question, which is, how has the housing and services made people's lives better? You know, if we were not here, how much worse off would they be? And so the outcomes that you're looking at that have come out of the creation of affordable housing units that we've been able to bring on board are the ones that we've been able to realize. So the key ones that we look at are really driven by, state and national outcomes of success for the population that we serve. So housing stability, recidivism in terms of psychiatric and medical hospitalizations. And of course, occupancy rate is a big one because some of the funding that we get is really determined, dependent on our ability to keep those beds filled. We could have a whole different, presentation on what some of those challenges are in terms of meeting those, but it's the reality, so we track it as an outcome. Incarceration for a population that's coming to us where they've had a lot of connections with the interactions, not always good ones, with the legal system, we see a really high rate of success in keeping people out of prisons. And then just the reputation that we have as a provider, I think qualitatively, I could tell you 100 stories about people that we've housed in these models. I could tell you the story of the lady who came to us from a really severe traumatic background, and this woman was on the streets for many years. And she finally came into one of the units, and this is one of the ones that was funded through the state. And within 6 months, she had gone back to writing, and she ended up writing a book, which she published. I mean, these are the reasons that make us get up every day, even though sometimes it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle every single day. But when you hear a story like that, you're like, okay, we can keep doing this for another 100 years. We can do it. There's also the story of the lady who, long history of both substance use disorders, severe trauma, was in shelters for many years, was on the streets for many years, came to Pathway Homes, and over the course of 10 years, she went on to not only get her bachelor's degree, she got a master's degree, she's now working, and she's looking to give back. And my final qualitative example is the one of parents who came to us, a couple that came to us, and they had lost their kids because they were taking away from them, because obviously they were going through really difficult times, were not able to care for them. And the beauty of it was that they ended up being reunified with their two little kids, 2 years and 4. I think one was 2 and one was 4. And now they've moved on. They stayed on, they got stabilized, and now they've moved on to alternate housing that is not even tapping into subsidy. They're using mainstream vouchers. Next slide, please. Okay, so this statement is here for a reason, because it's if I had a drum, I'd do a drum roll right now. Because like I said, HUD over the years has been really supportive of rolling out, these types of housing. So everything from the old SBC and SHP to now COC funding. But the big challenge that we as a community have found is that over the years, those have kind of gradually plateaued. We don't always get, the bonus funding, which is where we always get the opportunity to create new beds. But the state really stepped in a huge way about 5 years ago, when, the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, as we fondly call it, DBIDS, came out with the first ever infusion of PSH funds into Virginia. And we were very excited to be part of that. And there have been some amazing outcomes that have come out of that. This statement is really just to bring everybody's attention to the impact of COVID-19 in PSH, because we were on such a roll. Because of COVID-19, all of the money that would have been allotted for this year to roll out even more of these PSH units and services have become unallotted. It's huge for us, because if you think about the number of people, we're now up to 139 beds over 5 years. If you think about the number of people that would have been helped just by us as a provider, and the number now that are going to be in a holding pattern because of these funds being unallotted, the impact is huge. So that's all I'm going to say. We're going to ask that maybe Christine can expand on that, but we just wanted to make sure that it was really clear how big of an impact this is on actual people who are out there waiting to get into homes right now. Next slide, please. So real life examples of how we've kind of rolled out these models. And these are good examples because they show how we partner with different entities to make it happen. The first one is the partnership that we had with Christian Release Services. We still have it, CRS as we call them. And this is where CRS was able to acquire a 113-bed unit in Northern Virginia. And we came to an agreement with them where they were able to dedicate 26 of those units to the folks that we serve. Now that is diamond. If you guys know about housing folks, and all of these were 1-bedroom units, that is diamond and gold all rolled into one in PSH, because there's so many challenges in having people cohabitate that it sucks up a lot of time and resources to help them be successful. So being able to have this sublease agreement with CRS was huge because we were able to address some of the housing barriers that we face when we're leasing in these huge communities. So things like criminal background checks, things like credit worthiness, things like working with folks when they're going through, crises or just needing supports. This has worked out really well for us. So we're able to upfront negotiate a lot of the things that are a lot more difficult to do when you don't have this kind of partnership with the landlord. And the other thing is that all of these folks are in one building. It's not oversaturated, so as you can see the numbers. And we were able to leverage an office for our staff to be in. So the staff are located in the building, they're able to respond in real time, and they're able to work with the leasing staff of the landlord. And that's worked really well for us so far. The next one, this is a partnership that we have with the Fairfax County Department of Housing and Community Development, and Lloyd's going to expand on that. But basically, DHCD is a grantee. They get the funding directly from HUD, and then we're the sub-recipient. So we directly manage all of the operational aspects of the project. And this is an interesting project. We could do a whole couple of presentations on them, but we have the Fairfax County CSB also involved in terms of providing case management to folks who are engaged with them. We also have Pathway staff for providing some of those clinical supports, including a peer support person that's involved. And it's a fine dance that I think we all do beautifully. And it requires a lot of ongoing communication and flexibility. But the beauty of this is that we're keeping all of those 118 beds filled, and people are off the streets and doing really well. These beds were funded under the old SBC, but they're now all on the COC, and Laura will talk about that. The last one is our newest baby. This is the one with the state. It's a partnership with the state, and we are just really tickled pink about the way this came about and what we've been able to do with it. When the state rolled out these funds, Pathway Homes ended up being the only nonprofit provider in the mix. And so we partnered with the CSBs that you see on the slide, and we're able to bring the housing and all of the infrastructure that we have to the table, and the CSBs are on tap to bring all the clinical supports that make this such a wonderful marriage. This project is also an example of how we interpreted HUD's evidence-based PSH, with the underlying piece being keeping the housing supports separate from the clinical supports. If you've ever worked in the field with our population, you'll know that it doesn't end up well when the person who's providing supportive counseling and case management is also the person who's coming and talking to you about not paying your rent or having landlord legal problems that you now have to deal with. So this model is a really beautiful way of keeping those two very critical aspects of PSH separate, but still connected. And it takes a lot of coordination between the CSBs and us, a lot of communication, but it's working beautifully. And as I said, we're now rolling out the last 30 of those expansion units. So thanks again, Kristen, she's on the call. Thanks to the state. we hope that those funds become unallotted next year so we can keep doing this and we can keep the momentum that we've kind of picked up right now. Next slide, please. I think I'm almost done. Okay, well, it's a wonderful way to introduce Laura, because Laura is going to go take it from the top and speak to the partnership that we've had with DHCD over the many years that we've had SBC grants. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eleanor. I'll be sharing information on how the county's Department of Housing and Community Development supports the PSH model. And as Eleanor mentioned, one of HCD's very early relationships with Pathways was with the SPC grants. HCD was the applicant to HUD on behalf of the CSB and Pathways, and we all partnered together very successfully to address an important need in the county, which was to provide PSH to homeless individuals who also were diagnosed with mental illness. And with the Hearth Act of 2009, the program evolved, as Eleanor kind of alluded to, from an SPC model to a continuum of care rental assistance model. And what this meant was it consolidated several of HUD's programs that helped the homeless population. There was an increase in prevention resources and focus on PSH, and a greater emphasis on performance and positive outcomes for program participants. With the adoption of the Federal Uniform Guidance, or Part 200, in December of 2014, that grantee-subrecipient relationship was formalized, and the federal government required HCD as the grantee to have an even greater role in administering and monitoring the COC grants. So as a result, HCD was required to conduct annual regulatory, financial, and program monitoring, but because of Pathways' extensive experience with implementing COC PSH grants, Eleanor and Sylisa both mentioned just the great successes they've had, not only with HCD's grants, but also with their own direct COC grants with HUD. It's made it very easy for us to see the same similar successful participant outcomes that Eleanor mentioned, that housing stability that's so important, the ability to remain out of psychiatric hospitals. We've seen all of that in our 3 housing grants as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the public and county investment in PSH and why it's so important, it works together to help an individual holistically and comprehensively. And as Sylisa mentioned in slide 11, it also costs less in the long run from a return on investment to serve folks in a PSH model within the county's human services system. Housing, as we all know, it's important, it's critical, but it's those wraparound services, the supportive services such as case management, mental health therapy, self-sufficiency training, employment assistance. Those are all essential so individuals can remain housed and live independently to the best of their ability. If you're only offering housing support, for example, particularly for those with mental illness, you likely won't be able to keep them successfully housed for an extended period of time. This importance of PSH is also highlighted, as many of you know, in the county executive's draft strategic plan. It asks, how can we establish and integrate PSH into neighborhoods and communities for those who need it? The county's recently adopted community-wide housing strategic plan also elaborates on this and includes a strategy to expand access to housing options for persons with special needs. It's Fairfax County's collaborative partnership with all of you, with nonprofits, with organizations in the community to support PSH, which is so necessary because the county, we don't have the sufficient resources by ourselves. Our county's health, housing, and human service system, it's reliant on this strong public-private partnership. It's this interwoven network of county agencies, nonprofit, for-profit, secular, faith-based organizations that all work together to ensure that our most vulnerable residents here in our community, that they have the tools to be safe, healthy, and realize their full potential. We in the county, we leverage your local resources and expertise. Regarding the HCD and Office to Prevent and End Homelessness merger, as many of you know, that occurred July 1st of this year, and it marked the beginning of a new era for Fairfax County housing. It allows one agency to oversee the entire housing continuum, from helping to move individuals from homelessness into permanent housing, It promotes expanded housing opportunities. It builds on successful strategies, allows for greater effectiveness for clients and nonprofit programs. And lastly, it aligns the resources and approaches that both of our agencies have been doing for so long to provide greater clarity in the county's community-wide housing efforts for vulnerable residents. The PSH model has always been supported by both of our agencies, and this definitely will continue with the merger. An example of this success was in October of last year with the opening of the new Bailey's Homeless Shelter. As some of you know, there were 52 beds for individuals, including 4 medical respite beds, but there were also 18 PSH beds, which were so critical for that community. Next slide, please. In terms of capital funding or funding in general that has been offered through Department of Housing, CDBG and Home alone have allocated over $44 million to funding that has supported 300 or more acquisition projects alone, the majority of which are scattered sites, but we have funded some group homes for veterans, as well as individuals with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. We've funded a few multifamily projects, such as Cornerstone's 48-unit North Point, and most recently, Wesley Housing's 126-unit, the Arden project will be developed or constructed, and Chippen's 279-unit affordable housing in North Hill. Just as an aside, I think Sylisa alluded to that important model of capital funding along with subsidies and supportive housing. The Arden will receive SRAP project-based rental assistance for 4 of their units, and North Hill will receive 68 federal project-based vouchers in order to ensure that those are operational. Pathways 2 itself has received over $9 million to fund approximately 60 units using a very successful PSH model, where housing provides the federal capital funding and Pathways provides that critical supportive services piece. Just a little plug for capital funding that's coming down the pike. Our annual CDBG and Home RFP will be issued at the end of this month, and that's for scattered site units as well as multifamily units, up to 30 units. We're still finalizing the RFP, but in previous years, as some of you know, projects were given, or preference was given to projects serving special needs populations, low AMI, 60% AMI or below, including those offering supportive services and case management. In terms of the HUD match, I think Eleanor mentioned for Pathway COC grants, Fairfax County contributes cash as part of the HUD required 25% match requirement. The rest comes from tenant rents, but in order for the model to be successful, Pathways and the CSB also provide case management and clinical services. Finally, the blueprint funding, that's kind of the lion's share of our capital funding within HCD. As many of you know, $20.6 million is currently available. $7.6 million is our local affordable housing development and investment funds, close to $8 million in Amazon Reach funds through Virginia Housing, formerly VHDA, and a little over $5 million from the Tyson's Housing Trust Fund. The goals for this funding is new production or rental homes targeting 60% AMI or below, preservation of market affordable rental properties, and reduction of homelessness through the development of new PSH options for persons coming out of chronic homelessness. There's a pre-proposal conference on August 6th, and you must register by July 24th. And all of this funding that I've talked about, along with other HCD and RHA strategies, supports the county's goal to develop at least 5,000 new units of affordable housing in the next 15 years with no net unit losses. With that, I'll turn it over to Kristen for the next slide, please.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate the invitation to talk to you all today about what we've been up to, the state agencies in Richmond over really the last 5 or so years. So what you're looking at here is a visual of the governance structure of our interagency work around permanent supportive housing. So again, I'm Kristen. I'm with the Office of Community Housing at the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. Our office has only been in existence for about 1.5 years now, but I think really evidences the commitment of our agency as a services, disability services organization to housing. But we work in partnership with 7 other state agencies. You can see those here through an interagency leadership team and through a permanent supportive housing or PSH steering committee. I have to say this work is a lot like getting multiple huge cargo ships to start turning in the same direction. And so we've been working over the last several years to align policies and resources to really be able to produce more permanent supportive housing, including the services needed for these populations, with a focus on people with developmental disabilities, people with serious mental illness, and people who are chronically homeless. And because so much of that work is similar, we really have done a lot of work to make sure that we are coordinated and aligned, even if there are different stakeholder groups or entities advancing particular action plans. So the PSH steering committee has been meeting every other week for about the last 3 years, so really intensive work on these plans. You can see the plan to increase housing and supportive services options for people with developmental disabilities, called the VIPLO. That is posted on our website annually. There's also a separate housing strategy group around people with serious mental illness. And especially when it comes to the state's work around chronic homelessness and around people with serious mental illness, we recognize that there's so much overlap there between that work, that that's a place where we really make sure that the Governor's Coordinating Council on Homelessness work around people with SMI is really well coordinated. Next slide, please. So this is back again. You know, I think everyone has referenced those critical ingredients to permanent supportive housing: the capital, the rental assistance, and supportive services. What are we doing to try to align those resources to produce more PSH for state priority populations? So the low-income housing tax credit program has had scoring incentives since 2015 related to the DOJ settlement agreement population. Starting in 2019, there's now the threshold scoring requirement that 10% of all units have a leasing preference for a population where Virginia Housing and a state agency have an MOU around the work. So that now is our agency. So we are working in partnership with Virginia Housing to align the people and the supports for those leasing preference units. The DHCD's Affordable and Special Needs Housing program, all of the funding in there has scoring incentives for PSH. My agency has both a trust fund that can be used for capital investment, and periodically we will invest one-time funding in capital projects for looking at doing more of that as well. And obviously all of this work happens also with local and private capital. So you can see a lot of players involved, a lot of different funding streams that are all built into these action plans that we're working from. Long-term rental assistance, the partnership with housing authorities has been and will remain very important, especially as we've seen these new mainstream vouchers come down the line, making sure that we're working with local partners to convey what state priorities are, to build relationships so that those important housing vouchers can be used toward the state's PSH goals. Laura referenced the SRAP, State Rental Assistance Program for people with developmental disabilities. Now that's at about $12 million to serve about 850 households. That funding stream looks just like a voucher program. We contract with local agencies, primarily housing authorities, and they administer that funding just like the voucher program. We also, as Eleanor referenced, have the state's permanent supportive housing funding. The largest amount of that is funding for people with serious mental illness. That's about $17.2 million for just over 1,200 households, and we have a small amount that serves pregnant or parenting women with substance use disorders as well. That funding is used primarily for rental assistance. And I'll talk about how that's structured in just a minute. But we also, moving down to how we're funding supportive services, we also invest a good bit of that funding in the tenancy supports that Eleanor spoke of. So we're not just funding the rental assistance, we're funding housing stabilization services at the community level to really create permanent supportive housing, more than just rental assistance. Medicaid is a huge partner in this. It's a huge partner in the ongoing sustainability of services. So they are most certainly at the table. On the DD side, we have waivers that have been redesigned to better support people in more integrated settings. Community Housing Guide is a new waiver service that is structured to fund tenancy supports. State's also working on behavioral health system enhancement and working on infusing housing stability, housing supports into those restructured services is important. We're also eagerly anticipating a new family support benefit to the Medicaid program. DMAS is in negotiations with CMS to be able to add housing and employment supports to the state's Medicaid plan for designated high-need populations. So these are the two action plans we work from. They're both more than a dozen pages each. They all touch on those core components and what the action steps each state agency is taking on to advance the ultimate goal of increasing PSH. They are reviewed by the NVAHA Leadership Team, which meets quarterly. That's the executive leadership of those 8 state agencies. We have quarterly reporting that we do to make sure that we're accountable to advancing the action plan. And we have 2 stakeholder advisory groups, one around the DP population and one around the SMI population. Again, the VIPLO is posted on our website, and you can leave it here. The link you see here to the DHCD 2020 report is where you can find the SMI action plan, along with a lot of other information about our work around the SMI population. So the SMI work comes out of the DEEDS Mental Health Reform Commission, which had a housing legislative work group that was the genesis for a lot of the work that my office has done around needs analysis. It's what requires DHCD to lead this effort around people with serious mental illness and to report on it annually. The 2019 QAP I referenced, there's really a lot of work going on between our agencies to make sure as those units come online that all of the pieces are in place to be able to identify individuals, have successful referrals, successfully lease people up, and make sure that they have the supports they need. And again, in this coming year, we're really focusing on public housing authority partnerships and examining how to project base potentially more of our state rental assistance. Next slide. This is how our state PSH funds are structured. It's very deeply targeted. We do a lot of work with our local providers, and that's 19 community services boards and 1 nonprofit. That 1 nonprofit Eleanor referenced is Pathway Homes. They said, that they're recognized as a leader regionally. I would add that they're definitely recognized as a leader across the state. Really pleased to be in partnership with them. But we really work with everyone to identify high priority populations. That includes people leaving state psychiatric hospitals and people experiencing chronic homelessness. So they're all working in coordination with their local COCs. The funding itself is structured much like HUD's permanent supportive housing, long-term rental assistance funding stream. Again, we use a housing first, low barrier approach. We do fund housing stabilization specialists. That's a place where we think this Medicaid benefit, when in place, can pay for some of that, freeing up some of the state resources to serve as more long-term rental assistance. We also pay for the staff time to administer the rental assistance, one-time housing costs, such as security deposit, damages, furnishings, credit repair, that sort of thing. And a key component is we built this model around CSP partnerships. So whether or not they're the funded contractor for our permit supportive housing, we expect the Community Services Board to come in kind with the array of supportive services that they offer individuals in the community. In kind, meaning that it's not funded by our PSH funds. They're using the array of resources they have to fund their services to bring to the table in these partnerships. And they've been so enthused and able to recognize the benefit of the PSH resources that has worked well for the most part. Next one. So I think we wanted to talk a little bit about what was the need in Northern Virginia for more permit supportive housing for individuals with serious mental illness. So this is from a needs analysis that we did for the entire state. We're able to drill down by CSB catchment. I can talk more if folks are interested in how we did this needs analysis, but we were basically looking at very not high need individuals with serious mental illness who are homeless, who are in jails, who are high utilizers of CSB services, or who are in assisted living facilities and who live more independently. And so that 2016 needs analysis identified about 1,150 units needed in Northern Virginia for folks with serious mental illness. Now, to date, we've funded about 200 units. So we're really just kind of scratching the surface. So the state work to really bring all of this to scale is really clearly very important. Next one.
Kristen,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are you able to mute your phone? Are you on your, did you call in or we're getting some feedback, some noise feedback.
Yeah, my phone isn't on.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
sorry, I'm sure it's probably my AirPods. Sorry about that.
No problem. Go ahead. I apologize.
The worst part is I can't even tell that's happening. So I sound fine. Okay, so 1 year outcomes. I don't think I really need to make the case to this group that PSH is a wise investment, but just to kind of show you what some of the work that's been done at the state level to make the business case about return on investment. It is important to lots of other stakeholder groups that we say not only is this the right thing to do, but it is a wise investment. So we were able to use multiple administrative data sets to match our PSH clients who've been in housing for at least a year and look at what their service utilization was before they moved in and then a year after they moved in. So this is the culmination of that analysis, which showed a 29% reduction in cost for all of PSH move-in. Next slide. And then we can add back in the actual cost of the intervention, so the operating cost of permanent supportive housing, we can add back into that equation post move-in, and we find that there's still cost impact. So avoided costs of about $1,400 for every individual served, even after paying for a PSHEC intervention. I think that might be my last, yeah. Fine. So just wanted to show you a little bit of the work that's been done, not just to fund the resource, but to show its impact.
Thank you. And Michelle, before you continue, I do want to thank all the panelists again. These are, without the partnerships that we have with the individuals who presented, there's no way that PSH would be scaled up, certainly by Pathways or throughout the state. Effectively, and it's such it's so important to be able to make sure that we are broadening the table and inviting more individuals in to be partners in this process in order for us to be able to achieve our ultimate outcomes. So I just want to thank each person again who presented with me this morning. They did an awesome job, so thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yes, and we would like to thank all of you for your time and for sharing your expertise. And Sylisa, as you say, the incredible partnerships that are required to make these kinds of programs happen and to serve these people in our community. So, so thank you so much for that. We are going to open it up to questions. And again, if you can be on video and raise your hand, we are going to try and see who has questions and call upon you. If you're not speaking, again, please mute your phone so it'll make easier your screen. It'll make it easier for everyone else. So are there any questions?
Hi, Michelle.
Yes.
This is Eleanor. I was just going to add, if people don't have questions and you have time, we had embedded a couple of videos that I think really give a good picture of this in action. So if people don't have questions and you have the time, you may want to share that. Just thought I'd add that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we'll see. I am interested if Kristen maybe could just identify some of the state agencies. I know that not everyone in this group is as familiar with the state agencies that are working on this. So there's a little bit of alphabet soup up there. If you could just share the names of the agencies that are involved, that would be helpful.
Sure. So it's the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, the Department of Medical Assistance Services, and that's the state Medicaid agency, Department of Housing and Community Development, Virginia Housing, the Department for Aging and Rehabilitative Services, the Virginia Department of Health, Department of Social Services, and Department of Veteran Services. And among that group, we call 4 of us the core 4. And because of the populations of focus, we're really the ones with the heavy lift right now. And that's my agency, DMAS, EHCD, and Virginia Housing. All are important, but the heavy lift right now is on those.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to see the breadth of coordination at the state level. So that's great to show. Does anyone else have any questions about particular programs or sources of funding or ways to partner? No?
Sure.
Yes.
I just have a question. There was discussion of the money being unallocated by the state for 21 and 22. And is there a way, I understand that everything is up in the air with what COVID is going to cost and how much income the state's going to have, but is there a way to make sure permanent supportive housing is the first thing that is reallocated? If there is additional money, what can we do in that way?
So I do want to let you all know, if you are not aware, the Virginia Housing Alliance, which is our statewide organization that works on advocacy issues for housing funding, they are putting together a coalition now that will be sending a letter to the finance committees in both the House of Delegates and the Senate to remember their allocations for both the Housing Trust Fund and permanent supportive housing. These were substantial investments that housing advocates after many years were able to secure. And so the first thing on the table, and I think the letter goes out next week, is to say, don't forget that funding, maintain that funding, and if possible, advance that funding. There was a report that came out last week that said the approximate $1 billion shortfall that the state was anticipating in their budget is only $320 million. So the state is doing better than they anticipated in COVID. Now I know we haven't seen the whole picture, but there needs to be a really big advocacy push now for ensuring that that money is not lost and that also that perhaps it's advanced as soon as it can be. Well, if there are no other questions, thank our panel again so much. Let's give them a round of applause or a wave. We really appreciate your time. We may come back to you with more questions, but this has really been very helpful in understanding an important piece of our continuum of housing, something that we don't focus on as much as we should be. And I'm also very interested in learning how we can make sure that we embed some of these units in developments throughout the region. So thank you for sharing both your successes, the levels of funding, and how we can do more of this in the future. We appreciate it.